Hi everyone, this is Ashish, and today we are going to discuss about some of the common tooling that we use in Azure. And often we know how to use them, but when to use them is something that I often get this question in our community, in our Telegram community. So if you're not member of our community, please go ahead and join. I will give the link to the community. It's a one of the largest Telegram based community on Azure. You can post your questions, query, and a lot of members try to answer your questions. We have like almost around 8,000 members now. Okay, so coming back to the topic. So let me share my screen. So what we are going to discuss about today is, let me zoom in a bit. Yeah. So often we use these different tools to interact with Azure. We use AZ CLI, we use Azure PowerShell, we use Azure Bicep, and we now are getting to know another new CLI tool that is called AZD CLI. So using them or getting started with them is quite straightforward. That's not what we are going to discuss today. But often when you start using these tools, so for example, you start using AZ CLI, then you come across, you know that there is another command let in Azure PowerShell. We call command, we call those commands as commandlet in Azure PowerShell. What are commandlets? If you are new to the PowerShell, please follow my PowerShell series. There we have discussed in detail like how the PowerShell is structured and all. But here we are talking about Azure PowerShell. So PowerShell, module of Azure. For managing Azure. So we often see that there are commands which are overlapping with each other. So you can do the same thing with Azure CLI, and you can do the same thing using Azure PowerShell. And then you come across something called infrastructure as code tools like Azure Bicep, Terraform, which also sometimes lets you do the same kind of stuff. And then we have a new tool called Azure Developer CLI, or in short called AZD CLI. So what we are going to discuss today is when or why these tools are and when to use which one. So if you are using Azure and if you are managing resources in Azure, more often you might be using all of these four, or might be using one at a time, or might be using just one. But what exactly the use case where you see each of them help you do things, uh, do things in a better way. So let's begin with AZCLI. So AZCLI is a command line tool, and if we look at a basic AZCLI command to create a VM, it looks like something like that. So I'll just expand it a bit, or maybe I'll copy this and paste it here. So it's a command line tool. You can use it on command line. You have commands for managing resources on Azure. So for example, this command creates a virtual machine in a particular resource group with public IP address as null. So there is no public IP address. There is an image. This is the image reference, and then you mention other parameters, and then you just click on enter, and it creates a Azure VM in your Azure subscription if you are already logged in. So we have not found this resource group. So it expects you to create this resource group. So first you need to create a resource group, and then you need to create the VM, and then you need to and you need to follow these steps using command line. So there is a AZ group create, and you can name it like for example this, or let me do this, and then I can say location, and I can say location should be maybe east US or whatever, and then I will again, so it has been created. Now if I will run the same command, it will create the virtual machine in that particular resource group, and it will soon start. So it's a kind of a step-by-step process that where you run a AZ CLI command, and then you run AZ CLI command again, and then you follow a kind of a procedure to kind of run these commands step by step in a typical CLI tool experience. Uh, just like AZ CLI, you have PowerShell. So if we look at PowerShell, it looks similar. So you have this comparable same PowerShell command which creates a virtual machine with the same name, and if you compare it, you have these two commands very much similar. They just have different command what you call design or style. So in a typical PowerShell style, it's like verb versus noun. So if you're and that is the commandlet. So if you are new to commandlets follow this structure where you say verb, then you say noun. Oops. And then there are approved verbs that you need to use for PowerShell, and then you can have, and this particular one is coming from the module AZ module of PowerShell. So more or less they follow, they are looking like same. What difference PowerShell is there is that AZ CLI is a typical CLI command line tool only. However, Azure PowerShell is again gives you commandlets, but because it's PowerShell, it's a scripting language as well. So you can write your own logic in PowerShell. So suppose here we are creating the VM, and if you remember, when we did not have the resource group, we got the error because we were issuing a command without validating something is required. So for that reason, if you have some prerequisites, if you have some condition that you need to check first before going forward to run those commands, either in PowerShell or AZ CLI. So in case of AZ CLI, you have to have some scripting environment. So it can be bash scripting, it can be PowerShell. So AZ CLI itself is not a scripting language. It's just a CLI command line tool. However, when you are using PowerShell, Azure PowerShell, when you say Azure PowerShell, it itself has PowerShell. That means PowerShell files or PowerShell scripts will have all those methods, all those different way of doing scripting is already available to use in Azure PowerShell. So you can write your logic, you can write your things like, so for example, before I already have this thing. Oops. So for example, I want to check first if this VM exists. If it exists, then I want to delete this, and then if it does not exist, then I say it doesn't exist, and then further I go ahead and create those objects like for admin username, password, and credential object, which is a typical PowerShell object, and then I issue the command to create the VM. So if it exists, then delete it first. I mean, delete the resource group itself, so that you delete all the resources and then you create the VM. If it does not exist, then you go ahead and create the VM. So this is the typical PowerShell conditional logic. So you write your logic in the PowerShell, and that's the benefit of using PowerShell. So when you are using AZ CLI, you are only using command line operations. So when you want to check a VM, when you want to quickly create a VM, when you want to check some status of VM using some VM or any other resource in Azure, for example, AZ CLI supports all the different resources, so you can do any operations on those resources in Azure. But it's AZ CLI, the name suggests CLI, that means command line tool. If you want to do scripting, if you want to write some automation, if you want to write some logic, you have to have a scripting environment, and Azure PowerShell comes into picture because PowerShell and Azure PowerShell, they both kind of work together very seamlessly, and it makes sense to have Azure PowerShell working with PowerShell, writing logic in PowerShell, and then using that to create resources or to communicate to resources in Azure using Azure PowerShell. While I'm saying that, it is also possible to write those AZ CLI commands in a PowerShell file, just like I have written, and then write logics here, whatever logic you want to write, and then you do the operations using AZ CLI. Both ways are fine. The only difference here is that since you are using Azure PowerShell is already on top of PowerShell, so many different PowerShell capabilities you inherently get in Azure PowerShell. However, in Azure CLI, you might not be getting all of those, and you might need to create certain kind of things in a special way to handle those logics or creating those objects and so and so. So that is the difference between AZ CLI and PowerShell, or Azure PowerShell to say. So thinking about just quick ad hoc commands, AZ CLI. And when you are thinking about writing little bit more complex logic while still want to use AZ CLI or Azure PowerShell, PowerShell is the one that will give you that kind of scripting environment. Again, you can use AZ CLI with bash scripting as well, but yeah, I mean it depends on where you what exactly you are familiar with. Another thing that you will notice that PowerShell, Azure PowerShell follows PowerShell naming convention, PowerShell style of writing commandlets, using them. However, AZ CLI is more familiar or more easy to use for someone who is coming from a typical CLI tool experience that are developed with the Linux systems, kubectl, bash scripting, that kind of experience you get with AZ CLI. So when you are using AZ CLI and when you want to do some scripting, you can do with bash. Still, you can do with PowerShell as well, but you can do with bash, and that's the benefit of using AZ CLI. Now, which one to pick? So suppose you are a kind of a Azure engineer, you want to interact with you want to interact with the different services. Which tool to use from? Whether you want to use just a moment. You want to use AZ CLI, you want to use PowerShell. Which one to use? If you come from Windows or PowerShell background, Azure PowerShell is a kind of a default choice. If you are coming with a Linux background, then AZ CLI will look more familiar to you. Now, the next tool that we will talk about is Azure Bicep or Terraform. So when you are writing, let me go in the PowerShell. So writing such kind of logic or such kind of procedural scripting was the thing that we call declarative infrastructure as code. So declarative infrastructure as code says that you need to write all your logic, you need to define your dependencies, you need to figure out which should exist, what should not exist, and all those kind of stuff. And that's what we used to do in PowerShell, or still doing in PowerShell, or we still have to do with PowerShell for many of the cases. But when it comes to infrastructure as code, and again, what is the benefit of infrastructure as code, we have already covered in one of the session. If you have not watched it, please go ahead and watch it. Here what we are talking about, that you have figured out that now you need to use infrastructure as code to use all those benefits. What exactly, why exactly you should go for Bicep, and when exactly you can see you need to use Bicep, and when exactly you need to use Azure PowerShell and AZ CLI while you're still using Bicep. So you might come across experiences, or if you're still learning Azure or infrastructure as code, you might come across where you need to run some command using AZ CLI, but still you are defining infrastructure using Azure Bicep. So what Azure Bicep simplifies that for you, that you don't have to write all these logics. So it is all declarative. So for example, if we will go with one of the Bicep file, so you can say, you are just declaring what you want to have. So you want to have a resource group with ACR, or what would be the location. You don't define whether it exists or not exists. If it exists, then what need to be done. If does not exist, what need to be done. Those kind of logic will be taken care by infrastructure as code. So that's the benefit of using Bicep. And that's when you start to use Bicep. But when you want to deploy Bicep, you have to use AZ CLI or Azure PowerShell. So defining the infrastructure configuration is something you do with Azure Bicep or Terraform, following the infrastructure as code pattern. But when it comes to deployment, Azure Bicep itself does not deploy. It defines the infrastructure, but to deploy you have to use one of the command that is for deployment, either using AZ CLI or using Azure PowerShell. So AZ CLI does have its own, for example, AZ sub oh, no AZ deploy sub create. Yeah, maybe I will just go ahead and open the documentation. This is the command actually, but there are parameters that you need to provide. Let me AZ deployment sub. So this is the command that you use for deploying a Bicep file, or Terraform. For Terraform, you have different Terraform commands, tf plan, tf apply, and all. So for Biceps, similarly, you have these AZ Bicep create, AZ Bicep, to create a subscription based level deployment, you use this command. So coming back to this topic, that if you want to use so if you are using Azure Bicep, you are defining your configuration without getting into these complex logic. So you don't have to write all these logics. So right now it is straightforward, and it may not look very difficult to choose Bicep over it. But when you go into the scale of deployment, when you are deploying hundreds and thousands of resources in Azure, you need to define all the resources. Then you need to figure out if something was not deployed, what needs to be done. If something was deployed, what needs to be done. All those conditional logic. Then you will come across the complexity of PowerShell or any scripting language that you want to avoid. And in that case, Azure Bicep or Terraform or any infrastructure as code tool that you want to use, kind of help you to avoid that complexity while still writing that reliable infrastructure as code in a very efficient way. So that comes to the Azure Bicep. So you define the Bicep files. So for example, here we have defined a Bicep file which uses a module, deploy a ACR container registry. Similarly, we have gone through, this is my Bicep training repository. There I have created resource groups, then I have created a storage account. So I don't have to deal with if this storage account exists, then what needs to be done. If it doesn't exist, what needs to be done. That kind of complex logical steps I need not to worry about. Bicep will automatically take care of that dependency, dependencies and all those either available, not available, state management, all those kind of stuff. Bicep and resource manager knows how to handle that situation, and you don't have to worry about that. Now this is okay. So we have covered AZ CLI, just a command line tool. Azure PowerShell, yet another command line tool with a PowerShell background. So it is easy to use with PowerShell when you want to write some complex logic. Same time, AZ CLI, it is possible to write PowerShell using use AZ CLI to do the management of resources. But again, because AZ CLI is not based on PowerShell, you might have to, see some other ways to handle certain object creation or certain kind of operations that you need to do with those values, manipulation and all. However, with Azure PowerShell, that makes very easy. But when you don't want to handle those complex logical stuff, or you don't have that, that's where infrastructure as code comes into the picture. Now comes to the AZD CLI, commonly known as Azure Developer CLI, Azure Developer CLI. Yeah. So Azure Developer CLI or AZD CLI comes into picture when you have things already defined using Azure Bicep. Now, these two tools commonly focus to the infrastructure engineer. So those people who want to use infrastructure or manage infrastructure. But when it comes to this tool, AZD CLI, it is focused to the developer experience. So what I mean by developer experience, that if I look at AZD, so let me go to the folder AZD, and in AZD demo, you have like something called infra. And in this infra, if you see, we have something called main.bicep, and this main.bicep defines the whole infrastructure. Now, a developer need not to worry about what's happening here. All he has to do is, a developer has to do is define a YAML, Azure YAML file. That YAML file defines, app source, host. These things are basically from Azure Developer CLI syntax. I have already a session created in past on Azure Developer CLI, how to create this, what all these things means. So please go ahead. Right now we are not getting in depth of this YAML or definition of AZD CLI, but what I want to demonstrate, that once you have this AZD defined structure of application source, like, this is your app. So for a developer, app source is the one where they work, and all they have to make sure that they have an infra folder which is defined with the infrastructure related stuff, and they go there, and let me go to the folder. So if I go here and cd tools, no, ISE demos tools, I think cd ISE AZD demo ISE tools AZD demo. Yeah. And in that, all I have to do is, so we have already created the VM. So let me delete this VM now, because, or let me open that and show you if it has created the VM. No need, just okay, just logging into the I'll just check the VM, and if I go to the resource group, it should be my resource group. Yeah, my resource group, and you have this VM. Now I will delete this VM using the same PowerShell file that we have. So if VM exists, so let me just go ahead and check if this checks. Yeah, and I'll run this part of the code. So it should print VM does not exist, or it should print VM exist, and I'm going to delete. So it says VM exist, I'm going to delete. So yeah, I just deleted the VM. Now let's go back to the terminal and cd IC tools AZD demo. So here is our different files that defines the AZD configuration. AZD configuration is defined in Azure YAML. Again, if you are not familiar with AZD CLI tool, I recommend you to go through my AZD demo session, and there I have explained how to define all these directories, how all these configuration file. Here all I have to do is, as a developer, AZD up considering I already have installed AZD CLI, which is different than AZ CLI. Again, AZ CLI infrastructure focused deployment. So when you are an infrastructure engineer, you want to deploy some resources in Azure, you are the infrastructure guy, you know how to configure networking, you know how to configure storage account, how to configure virtual machine. Those things are your responsibility. AZ CLI is the tool. But when we talk about AZD CLI, this is used by developers who might know all those things, but that's not their primary responsibility. So what they know is that they have application in a folder and they have developed some code and they want to deploy that application. And for that, they have got some infrastructure defined by some some infrastructure team. And all they know is that if I have this structure properly defined using this YAML file, I should be able to run AGD up and it should go ahead and do all its stuff like it's doing. It's packaging the application, deploying the resources. It's deploying different resources in Azure. So developer need not to worry about all these stuff. That's when you use AZD CLI. So let this resources created. In the meanwhile, let's go ahead. So this is infra engineer focused to deploy resources using a CLI interface. Yeah, PowerShell. Do it this way. Same thing, same kind of stuff. So Azure PowerShell gives you the same CLI interface with VM has been deleted. Okay, fine. With PowerShell scripting experience. So when you want to write complex logic, you have the PowerShell already there because Azure PowerShell is based on PowerShell. So you can use your existing PowerShell knowledge when you are working with Azure PowerShell. Having said that, you can still use your PowerShell knowledge with AZ CLI as well, but that's not a natural path. AZ CLI is more about bash scripting, bash friendly, not really something written anywhere, or I would say there is no such thing as such which was defined. But at the same time, if you use AZ CLI and if you have been using bash based CLI tools, you will feel kind of a friendly interface. However, when you use Azure PowerShell and if you are not coming with the Windows background or PowerShell background, you will not really feel comfortable. So that's the kind of opposite two different infrastructure administrator background, Linux focused, Windows focused, and these two tools are targeting each one of them. Having said that, either can use, but yeah, they have some target. They have been designed in such a way, I would say. Now Azure Bicep infrastructure as code configuration. So you define infra as code. Having said that, when you write a Azure PowerShell file, when you write a AZ CLI using bash script or PowerShell file, you still write infrastructure as code, but this one is declarative. So this is the difference. Declarative, I think, yeah, declarative. So this is the difference. So declarative means that you define or declare the resources and that's it. You don't define the logic. However, these two tools like PowerShell is sequential or procedural scripting. So you need to define each step. If something goes wrong in the next step, you need to figure out what if else, try catch, all those stuff. But here you don't. Now at the same time, AZ CLI is developer focused. So when you have a focused and enable self-serve infra deployment for developers. So you are a developer, you know how to define your application, you have developed an application using Python, C# or something, and you need some resources to deploy them, and you don't want to kind of define those resources. You already have someone to define that, so they can, this AZD CLI or template gives you that framework using which you and infrastructure engineer can collaborate with each other. So infrastructure guy can focus on infra folder, you can focus on apps source folder, and then you both can work together and then deploy resources using AZD up command. And you can see this has been already deployed, and if I go ahead and open that page, should open, yeah, and it has opened. So this is something I just demonstrated. And then when developer is done, AZD down, they don't have to worry about having the go to the portal, delete the resources, all those things. AZD down something, just go and check all the configuration and go to the Azure and delete all the resources that you have deployed. So this is the kind of orchestration engine provided to developer in a very friendly way. So this is the use of these tools, and this is how you can kind of, if you see, all of them have somewhere overlapping functionality, and if you see, you might be using all of them or combination of one or two or three, combination of two or more than two, based on your requirement. So as you can see, AZD CLI cannot work on its own. It has to have Azure Bicep or Terraform defined with it so that it can deploy the resources. Similarly, when you write Azure PowerShell, yeah, you might come across some places where AZ CLI is the right tool for you, because it gives you some. So for example, when you run AKS specific operations on Azure, AZ CLI is more comfortable for those kind of operations as compared to Azure PowerShell. Again, it's a personal opinion, but this is how it looks like when you do some resource operations. One tool looks better than other, but at the same time they all have a focused use case. Similarly, when you use for example AZ CLI, it is very good for ad hoc operations like running the command line commands, but when it comes to scripting, you have to choose either bash script to use AZ CLI in a kind of an automated way, or PowerShell. Either of one, you have to have a scripting environment if you really want to script AZ CLI commands. Otherwise, it's just a command line interface tool. So this is the kind of use case of these resources. These tools. The primary focus of this video is not really getting into each of one of them. It's more about understanding which one to use where. Put your comments in the video if you like this, or how do you use it, or do you have any other idea where you might be using one of these tools that I missed to cover. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.